The valet line stretched along the front of Beckett and Associates like something out of a magazine shoot. String lights, a jazz quartet, women in cocktail dresses. I pulled my F-150 up to the entrance, handed my keys to an attendant, and that's when I saw my son. He was wearing a red vest, not the charcoal suit I'd helped him pick out 3 months ago when he got the job. A red polyester vest with a gold name tag and a set of car keys in his hand that belonged to someone else's Lexus. He was moving quickly, professionally, head down. That was always how Daniel did things. Get it done. Don't complain. He'd learned that from me, from years of watching me leave before sunrise to wirehouses and commercial buildings so he could go to school without checking his bank account first. He hadn't seen me yet. Then Harlan Beckett walked through the front doors with 2 men in expensive suits behind him, and everything in my chest went cold. Frank, he extended his hand with a smile that must have taken years to perfect. Didn't expect you to make it tonight. Wouldn't miss it, I said. I shook his hand because that was the thing to do. Harlan turned toward the valet station and gestured broadly, like a man presenting something that amused him. I see you found our star employee. The 2 men with him laughed. Daniel looked up. Our eyes met, and I watched something go out in him like a candle being pinched. He opened his mouth and closed it again. We found the best use of a Wake Forest MBA, Harlan said, and the smile stayed exactly where it was. Turns out he has excellent spatial reasoning when it comes to parking logistics. More laughter. Harlan steered his guests back inside. My son was already looking at the pavement again, jaw set in a line I recognized from the day of his mother's funeral 12 years ago, when he was 18 and trying not to fall apart in front of the other mourners. I said nothing. I walked inside. Before I tell you what happened after that night, drop a comment. Where are you watching from? And what time is it right now? I want to know how far this story has traveled. This is not a revenge story. This is a story about what a man is worth, and who gets to decide. Daniel had called me 8 weeks earlier, his voice careful and measured the way it got when he was managing something he didn't want me to worry about. I started at Beckett and Associates last Monday, Dad. How is it? A pause I understood better than he knew. It's an adjustment. I'd met Harlan Beckett twice before the wedding and hadn't liked him either time. There was something in the way he spoke that reminded me of every project manager who'd ever tried to shortchange my crew smooth at the surface, with something harder underneath that only revealed itself when he thought no one important was looking. My son had fallen in love with his daughter Sloane during their 2nd year of graduate school. She was sharp and funny, and she made Daniel laugh in a way I hadn't heard since before his mother passed. When he told me he was going to propose, I'd hugged him and meant it. When Harlan offered Daniel a position at his firm as a wedding gift, I'd kept my reservations to myself. Daniel was 30 years old. He didn't need his father's doubts. He needed a chance. Now I stood in Harlan Beckett's marble lobby watching the man work every circle in the room, and I knew with the certainty of someone who had been reading people for 6 decades exactly what kind of man I was dealing with. Daniel came in from outside sometime after 9, still in the vest, with an exhaust smudge on the back of one wrist. He made his way toward the back of the room, and I fell into step beside him. "You don't have to stay," he said quietly. "I'm not leaving." We stood near the bar for a moment without talking. He was 2 inches taller than me and had been since he was 20, and sometimes that still caught me off guard. "How long has this been going on?" I asked. "It's temporary." Flat words. Something he'd been repeating to himself. "Sloane says her father just wants to see how I handle pressure. 3 months in the field, then a real position. 3 months. I'm not going to let it beat me, Dad." I looked at my son. 30 years old, MBA, standing in a red vest at his father-in-law's anniversary party, trying to convince himself this was normal. "I know you're not," I said. I drove home that night and sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning. On the wall above the stove hung a photo I'd put up years ago. Daniel at his college graduation, cap slightly crooked, grinning the kind of grin that only comes from actually earning something. Beside it, a photo of my wife Carol holding him the day he was born, her whole face lit from somewhere inside. I'd spent 31 years running Callaway Electric. Built it from 1 truck and a toolbox. Sold it 6 years ago for more than most people would expect looking at the way I lived. I'd kept the same house, the same habits, the same truck. The money had gone into real estate and long-term investments, and had been quietly growing ever since. I hadn't spent it on anything that couldn't justify itself. I thought about Harlan Beckett's smile, the two men beside him, my son's face when he looked up and saw me standing there. I picked up my phone and called Mel Torres. Mel had been my accountant for 22 years, and my friend for longer. She had a mind like a steel trap and no patience for performance. That's why I trusted her completely. It's past midnight, Frank. I need you to look into something. Beckett and Associates, real estate development, Charlotte. I want to know everything. Debt structure, active projects, anything that could be a pressure point. A silence. Then, give me a few days. She called back in 3. We met at a diner on Route 29, corner booth, coffee going lukewarm between us. Mel spread printed pages across the table the way she always did, organized and without ceremony. Beckett and Associates has a serious problem, she said, tapping the first sheet. They've been trying to acquire a parcel in Cabarrus County for 2 years. 43 acres that sits directly in the path of their biggest planned project, a mixed-use development, retail and residential. They're calling it Beckett Commons. Without that land, the anchor tenant can't build. Without the anchor tenant, the retail side doesn't commit. Without retail, the residential investors walk. She slid a map across. The whole thing unravels. I studied the map. Who owns it? Estate of a retired farmer. He passed 8 months ago. His daughter is the executor. Mel's expression was dry. She has been notably uninterested in selling to Harlan Beckett. Apparently, he lowballed her twice and sent lawyers once. She told his agent she'd rather donate the land to the county park system. Outside, the morning traffic on Route 29 moved steadily through ordinary errands. How much to buy it? I asked. Market value is around $2.8 million. She might take 3 from the right buyer. And what happens to Beckett's project if he can't get it? His construction financing has a milestone clause. Anchor tenant agreement has to be executed within 14 months, or the lender can call the loan. He's got 11 months left. She folded her hands. Frank, what are you planning? I'm going to buy that land. Mel looked at me for a long moment. Harlan Beckett will offer you whatever you want the minute he finds out. I know. You're not going to sell it to him. Not right away. She was quiet. Then she nodded once. I'll set up an LLC. You'll need a real estate attorney. Someone Beckett doesn't have a relationship with. Can you find one? I know someone in Concord. She's good, and she's careful. Over the next 6 weeks, I watched my son endure things that no man with his credentials and his character should have to endure, and every time we talked on the phone, I kept my voice even and steady and gave nothing away. Week 2, Daniel was assigned to manage parking logistics for a client dinner. Harlan had introduced him to the guests as our logistics coordinator, still finding his footing in the business world. Daniel told me this without any particular emotion, in that careful, measured voice. I told him he was doing great. Week 4, he called on a Tuesday, quieter than usual. There was a man at the company named Marcus Webb, an older project manager who'd started sitting with Daniel at lunch, brought him coffee sometimes, told him once, quietly, that he shouldn't let the place take anything from him that he'd walked in with. Daniel's voice warmed when he mentioned Marcus, and I was grateful for that man the way you're grateful for a stranger who shows up decent when everything else is making you doubt people. Week 6 came a text. Dad, Harlan announced, I'm moving to a guest experience coordination role next quarter. Sloan says it's a good sign. I don't know what that means. I put the phone down and called Mel. Where are we? Papers signed last Tuesday. It's yours, Frank. I sat with that. 43 acres in Cabarrus County. Purchased through Callaway Property Holdings, LLC. A name that meant nothing to anyone who didn't already know. Set up the meeting, I said. 2 weeks. Harlan Beckett's conference room was exactly what I'd expected. Glass walls, a long table, a view of uptown Charlotte spread out below like a diagram of ambition. He'd brought his attorney and his lead developer, a tense man named Craig who looked like he hadn't slept well in a while. Mel sat beside me. I wore a button-down shirt and clean work pants. Not a suit. I didn't own one, and I wasn't going to borrow one for this. Harlan didn't recognize me at first. The practiced ease was in place, the handshake firm, the smile welcoming. Then his eyes settled on my face, and something shifted in the room the way pressure shifts before weather changes. Frank, his voice held. I didn't realize you were involved in real estate. I'm not. Mostly. I folded my hands on the table. I'm involved in one particular piece of land. His attorney leaned over and said something quiet near his ear. Harlan nodded once. "The Cabarrus parcel," he said. "Callaway Property Holdings. That's me." The silence that followed was the kind that people fill carefully or not at all. Craig, the developer, was looking at Harlan with the expression of a man assessing structural integrity. "What do you want for it?" Harlan asked. The smoothness was still there, but working harder now. I looked at him for a moment before I answered. I wanted him to sit in that silence. I wanted him to understand whose clock this conversation was running on. "Before we talk about the land," I said, "I want to talk about my son." His jaw shifted. "This isn't the place for." 3 months ago, I drove to your anniversary gala and found my son parking cars in a red vest while you introduced him to clients as a punchline. My voice was level. I'd worked on being level. He has a master's degree from Wake Forest. You hired him with the understanding that he'd have a real position. Instead, you've spent months using him as a prop for your own amusement. He is learning the business from the... He is not learning anything in a parking lot. I let that sit. You've been humiliating him because you could. Because he loves your daughter and he believed that if he kept his head down long enough, you'd decide he'd earned your respect. I paused. He was wrong about you, but he was never wrong about himself. The room was different now. Craig had found something to study on the table. The attorney had set his pen down. Harlan leaned back. The smooth voice dropped half a register. "You bought that land to leverage me. I bought that land because the woman selling it didn't want you to have it, and I had the means to make sure you didn't." I opened the folder Mel had prepared and slid a document across the table. "But I'm not here to hold it indefinitely. I'm here to make one offer." He looked at the document, didn't pick it up. "My son gets a real position. Director of Project Development, a title, a salary appropriate to his experience, and genuine operational responsibility. In writing, permanent." I tapped the page. "And you never publicly diminish him again. Not at events, not in meetings, not in front of clients. Not ever." His jaw was working. The room had gotten very still. "And if I agree, I sell you the land at a fair price. 3.1 million. Market value plus a reasonable margin for my time. No conditions after the sale. No further obligations." He stared at me for a long time. The clock behind his head moved in small, quiet increments. Charlotte traffic hummed somewhere below the glass. "You'd spend that kind of money," he said finally, not quite asking, "over a parking lot." "I'd spend twice that," I said, "to give my son what he earned." Craig cleared his throat. "Take the deal, Harlan." He said it quietly, without drama, like someone reading a measurement aloud. The pen came out. Harlan signed with a hand steady enough to be dignified, and I'll give him that much. We shook hands at the door. Out of habit, his grip was firm. "He'd better deliver," Harlan said. "He will," I told him. "He always has. You just weren't paying attention." I called Daniel from the parking garage. He answered on the second ring. "Dad, everything okay? Can you meet me for dinner? Hawthorne's on South Boulevard." "Sure. What's going on?" "I'll explain tonight." "How was your day?" A beat. Then, in the careful voice, "Something strange happened. Harlan announced this morning that I'm being moved to a director role next week. Project development." Sloan seemed surprised, too. A pause. "It's the position I was supposed to have 6 months ago. I don't know what changed." "I'll explain tonight," I said again. At dinner, I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which he'd learned from me, and which I'd always been proud of. When I finished, the restaurant had quieted around us. He looked at his water glass for a long time. "You spent $3 million, he said. Net cost was closer to $300,000 once the land sold. Attorney fees, Mel's time. Dad, it was the right use of the money." He looked up. His eyes were wet, which he was managing carefully, the same way he'd been managing everything for months. "I should have walked out," he said. "The first month. I should have left. Maybe. But you were trying to give it a fair chance. There's no shame in that." I reached across and gripped his arm for a moment. The shame belonged to him. Sloan knew, he said quietly. Not everything, but she knew it was more than a training period. She never said a word. I didn't answer that. It wasn't my marriage. He looked at me. "What do I do with that? That's between you and her. But I'll tell you something. A partner who watches you get diminished and chooses their comfort over your dignity, you have to decide what that's worth to you. Only you can decide that." He nodded slowly. turned his glass in his hand. Marcus. Marcus Webb, the project manager who's been decent to me. I want to make sure he... That's up to you now, I said. You're director of project development. Act like it. Something changed in his face then. Not the graduation photo grin, something quieter, more durable than that. He sat up slightly, almost imperceptibly, and I watched my son make a decision about who he was going to be. Okay, he said. Okay. The following months were different. Daniel walked into Beckett and Associates on a Monday with a business card that had his actual title on it and a third-floor office with a window. He learned the operations with the same focused discipline he'd applied to everything since he was 12 years old and decided he was going to understand how engines worked before his next birthday. Marcus Webb, it turned out, had 3 decades of real estate project experience that had been sitting largely unused under Harlan's management. Daniel gave him the development oversight role on the Cabarrus project and a direct line to the executive team. Harlan kept his end of the agreement. He was cold, controlled, and present less and less often. The public diminishment stopped. I think he understood, at a level beneath the bitterness, that he hadn't been beaten by trickery. He'd been beaten by patience, by a man who'd lived small for 30 years and built something durable while Harlan was busy performing wealth. Daniel and Sloan had conversations I wasn't part of. What I know is that by the end of the year he had his own apartment, and the divorce concluded without ugliness. He left with what he'd come in with, which turned out to be more than enough. 6 months after that, Beckett Commons broke ground. I drove out to Cabarrus County on a Tuesday morning and stood at the edge of the site while Daniel walked through a phasing plan with a team of engineers. He had a hard hat and a company jacket, and he was pointing at the site map with the same focus I used to see when he was 16 and doing homework at the kitchen table. He spotted me eventually, raised the hard hat in my direction, just slightly, and turned back to his engineers. That was enough for me. People ask whether I regret it. $3 million is not a small commitment, even if the net cost was lower. They want to know whether it was worth it. It was worth it. I'd do it again before the question finished. They also ask if it was revenge. It wasn't. Revenge would have been collapsing Harlan's project entirely, watching the deal fall apart, leaving him with nothing. That might have felt satisfying for a short while, but it would have hurt people who had nothing to do with any of this. Employees, contractors, the tenants who'd committed to the development. And it would have left my son standing in the wreckage of a company he was now supposed to run. What I did was restore a balance that someone had deliberately tilted wrong. I gave my son back the standing that had been taken from him. That's not revenge. That's a father doing the only job that ever really mattered. Harlan sold his majority stake in the company 18 months later, retired somewhere on the Gulf Coast. Mel told me. She hears everything eventually. The company changed its name shortly after. The sign out front now says Callaway Web Development. I don't have any stake in the company. I didn't want one. I wanted my son to have what he'd earned. Last Thanksgiving, Daniel drove up from Charlotte with a woman named Priya. She's a civil engineer who works on the public infrastructure side of the county where the development sits. They met, arguing about drainage easements at a municipal planning meeting, which tells you everything you need to know about both of them. She sat across from me and looked me in the eye and said, "Daniel talks about you constantly. He says you're the reason he understands what integrity looks like." I told her I was just his dad. After dinner, Daniel and I stood on the back porch the way we used to when he was young, and we needed to talk without making it a whole thing. Cold November air, the neighbor's Christmas lights already up, the yard dark and familiar. "Are you happy?" I asked him. He thought about it the way he does with questions that deserve real answers. "Yes," he said. "Yeah, I am." I nodded. "Dad." He looked at me sideways. I should have trusted myself sooner. I kept telling myself if I proved enough, eventually he'd have to respect me. But I think I was afraid that walking away would look like failing. "Walking away from something designed to diminish you isn't failure," I said. "It's self-respect." He was quiet. "You spent $3 million to teach me that." "No," I said. "You already knew it. I spent $3 million to give you back the room to act on it." He put his arm around my shoulders the way grown men do with their fathers, when neither one wants to be sentimental, but both of them feel it. We stood there for a minute looking at the neighbor's lights, and then we went back inside to the warmth. I'm 63 years old. I live in the same house I bought in 1987. I drive the same kind of truck I've always driven. My biggest indulgence is the first cup of coffee before anyone else is awake. Carol's photo is still above the stove. Some mornings I talk to her. I tell her how Daniel is doing. I tell her about Priya, that she seems like the real thing. I tell her she would have liked her. I was thinking about something Carol used to say, that there are men who spend their whole lives building towers to prove something, and there are men who build houses where the people they love can stand up straight. She never had to tell me which kind she thought I was. I knew, and I spent every year after she said it trying to make sure she'd been right about me. Money grows back. Dignity doesn't. That's the whole lesson. Everything else is just details. My son walked into a building with his own name above the door, and he was ready for it, because he'd already decided who he was before anyone gave him the title. That's the part I can't take credit for. That came from him, from Carol, from somewhere in the combination of everything they were and everything they built together in 30 years of an ordinary, extraordinary life. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe they're somewhere right now working twice as hard as the people around them and being told it still isn't enough. Maybe they need someone to remind them that it is, that they are. Subscribe if you believe stories like these are worth telling, and leave me a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you would have done. I read every one.